Welcome to Writer's Digest Presents. Hosted by the editors of Writer's Digest, this monthly podcast features conversations with writing and publishing experts whose insights will help ignite your creative vision, hone your skills, build your platform, and get your work out into the world. Welcome back to Writer's Digest Presents. In February of 2021, WD managing editor Mariah Richard began a Flash Fiction February challenge on the WD website. The challenge is back for a second year this year, so we're dedicating this episode of the podcast to Flash Fiction. You will hear interviews with Rand Walker about Flash Fiction and with Gina Barreca on Flash Nonfiction. And as a bonus, you'll hear the second half of Mariah and Michael's MFA conversation from episode 1. But first, we'd like to chat a little bit about writing short stories and Flash Fiction. So, hello everyone. Glad to see you all again.
Hi.
Hello.
Hello.
So I want to start off by talking about the February writing challenge. And I was here when we started it. It's only a year old, but for the life of me, I can't remember how it came about. Can anyone remember?
I can start us off on this. Mariah and I would often meet like weekly to talk about stuff we were going to do online. And we would talk about, just the content that we're going to put on there, the articles, blog posts, all that type of stuff. But we also would usually just kind of brainstorm at times, like just talk about, things we care about in writing or things we'd like to see. And I know talking to Mariah, she had this great interest in Flash Fiction. And I just started thinking, like, wouldn't it be cool to do like a daily Flash Fiction challenge? Because we actually do that in April and November for poetry, where we do like a prompt a day, a poem a day, and like I would write a example poem to whatever the prompt is for poetry. And I thought this might be fun for Flash Fiction, but I didn't want to like force it on Mariah. But like Mariah like heard the idea and was like, yeah, let's go do it. So Mariah, like, I'll let you like kind of take the baton from there, because that's kind of what you did. You like just took that idea and like ran with it.
Yeah, it was one of those things where since graduating from my MFA program in 2017, I'd kind of had like a very long writing dry streak. So I like half wrote 2 different novels, and I'd kind of let writing Flash Fiction go to the wayside, which was unfortunate because that's really the only things that I've gotten published before are my Flash pieces. So it felt like a sign from the writing gods that like, hey, not only are you going to encourage people to participate in this kind of writing, which you really enjoy, but it'll kind of force you to have a deadline and to write these pieces with everyone. So that's really like what inspired me to really dive into the project. And the biggest thing from last year's challenge that I just did not expect was the joy of sharing what in my program we called our shitty first drafts, which it was kind of like a no-no, right? Like when you come to workshop, you don't want to have a first draft. You want to kind of have some polish to it. So I was very weird and insecure, and Robert will tell you, I would be like, I can't believe that I'm going to be posting these first drafts. I'm kind of nervous about what people are going to think. And Robert was really kind, and ultimately he said, this is to show everyone else that it's okay to not have a perfect piece to share. It's just about sharing the joy of writing. And that really happened on the comments of those posts. Everybody was replying to each other, saying, the things that they liked best about the pieces, and really just celebrating this month of getting together and writing together. It was really awesome.
It sounds like it. So there were how many participants generally or approximately were there last year?
Oh, I'm not sure, Mariah. Was it like, it had to be over like 100 something.
Yeah, from the top of my head, I think that the most posts on one day's prompt was somewhere around like 130 stories were shared.
Wow.
And then on like our lowest day, I think we had something like 72.
Yeah,
So,
and those are the ones where people are actually posting. Because I know
Right.
from the Poetry Challenge that there is a lot of writers who will write poems and then let me know. Like, I remember last year being contacted by someone who'd been writing the Poetry Challenges for like over a decade and said that she finally had the bravery to like share poems this past year.
Wow.
On there, but that she had been writing alone, like along at home, but not posting it to the site, which is like another fun part of the challenge. Like, I think it's fun to be able to share with people and get that feedback, but it's also like, if you want to do it privately at home, I'm an introvert, so like I totally get that. It can often seem like at times like that I'm not, if you read stuff I post on the site all the time, can make it seem like I'm a lot more talkative than I am, but I'm just as scared as anyone else to share stuff. So like I totally get that, but yeah, like I think for the comments, like, you know, it's probably like about 100 like or so that were commenting, and then who knows how many writing silently along at home. And,
Wow.
and it's like so much.
Yeah, that's
like, I don't know
incredible.
for you, Mariah, like that's like kind of one of the really uplifting parts of the challenge is just the whole community aspect of it.
Yeah, it definitely is. And, you know, even one kind word can give you a boost you didn't know you needed. And I know for me personally, I have taken some of the pieces that I wrote for last year's challenge and polished them up a little bit and have performed them at open mics. And I'm actually going to be doing a live critique through a writing group locally in a couple of days, which is like another form of terror. Basically, I'll be reading the flash piece live. No one will have read it beforehand, and then immediately after, they will critique the piece. So it was really just that I thought, you know, if all of these people are looking at my shitty first drafts, then, and they're giving me nothing but kindness, you know, it's not going to hurt me if I do this live critique.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting to see the way that community can really boost you, not just your writing, of course, but just you personally and the way that you view your own work.
So I'm sort of in awe of both you and Robert for being able to post your poems and your short stories on the website for everyone to read.
Amy, maybe by
I
this
have
time you and
not-
I will have done one.
I can probably commit to one.
Me too.
We'll try and make that happen, Michael.
Yeah, okay.
Well, so I want to talk a little bit about. I interviewed Rand Walker for this episode of the podcast, and we got to talking about our experiences with reading flash fiction, which for me, I was telling him it's my experience reading short stories is very, very different than when I read longer book length works. So with books, it's sort of like an addiction. I can't not be reading a book. So after I finish one, I don't sit and think about the book that I just read or internalize it or have feelings about it to a point where I can't pick up the next book. I have to pick up the next book almost immediately, which is not great sometimes because then, I lose the thing that I just read. Or sometimes I will end up conflating two books that I've just read. But with short fiction, with short stories, I feel like it's a much different experience. After I finish one, there's that moment that really hits you. I feel like short stories end on a bang almost. And I have to sit there and think about and process what I just read because it feels like so much has happened in such a short space, in so few words, and I find that incredible. I wonder what your experience is like with reading short fiction or short works.
I totally agree with you, Amy. And I think there's something about short stories and flash fiction where it's this weird experience of less is really more. And short fiction just has the opportunity to be really experimental and unique, and it follows its own rules a lot of the times, in my opinion. And when I'm feeling as a writer particularly stuck or uninspired, I will probably pick up a short story collection or read a short story before I'd start reading a novel, because though I read novels sort of in the same way that you do, just sort of compulsively, short fiction just does something to my brain that like immediately makes me want to be more creative. And I think it's just because there are less rules around it, because you have less time in short fiction, so you get to do kind of whatever you want.
I think I'm kind of the opposite, where I will read something, and if it hits me in a certain way, I become obsessed. So the outlet for that, especially if like it's just a one-off book or like the end of a series, is fan fiction.
Yeah.
And fan fiction, like when we talk about drabbles, those are stories that are just like 50 to 100 words a lot of times. And it's really fascinating to see the way that people interpret different characters, but also like what Michael was just saying, how they explore different mediums. So one of my favorite flash pieces ever is a fan fiction that is based on a Reddit thread. So you're literally reading a story and it's just a Reddit thread with these characters. And it was so strange and fascinating that that's where one of the prompts from last year's Flash Fiction Challenge came from. I asked people to write somebody's Tinder bio, and that was the story. So I think that there's something about short fiction that drives you outside your
Right.
comfort zone and outside the box, and it really makes you look at things from a different perspective.
Yeah, and I'm maybe a little bit closer to Mariah in how I read stories, whether they're long or short, is like, you know, well, and maybe I'm totally different because, like, you'll move on to the fan fiction, but like I read something and I'm not usually ready to like jump into the next thing. I'm usually like, all right, I've got this big world in my head. Now what do I do with this world? And how do I process this? And where do I go with it? Do I write something? Do I read something? Where, like a lot of times, like I'm not even sure. And I like to kind of sit with it, even if it's for like the night or whatever. So sometimes, like when I read a short story collection, like I'll think, okay, this short story collection's like 250 pages long. It's got like 12 stories in it. This novel's like 500 pages long. I can knock out that 500-page novel in about the same time that I can knock out about 3 stories from the short story collection, because it's like I have to like kind of sit and process each story as I go through them. So even though they're shorter, I've got this, like it's almost like I give the same amount of emotional weight to each of them, even though one's much longer and probably like more involved with all the characters and the plot and everything. It's like that short story is also like its own little world anyways. So it's kind of, it's interesting, and it's something I really didn't think about till you asked the question. It's like, oh yeah, like it is a little bit, it's a little bit different. Like in some ways it's kind of the same how I read them, but it's also a little bit different because you would think that the word count would be similar, and that doesn't really matter. It's like the world itself that's similar for me. So
yeah, I think the word count is part of what interests me about that, and I think why I do take a pause after the short stories, whereas I don't with the novel, because with the novel, I've had 70,000 words, and I'm sort of, occasionally I will feel sad about leaving that world and be ready to move on, or want to stay in there, as opposed to moving on.
Yeah.
But with the short fiction, because it's so few words, I'm so, it's like I'm impressed by the novelists who can write that many words about a story and make it coherent and hold their and my attention for that amount of time. But I have another kind of respect for the short story writers who can do so much, or the equivalent of a novel in such a short amount of space. Yeah. That deliberateness with the words that they use, I think, is really impressive. So are there any short stories or works of flash fiction or nonfiction that will always live in your head, that you will never be able to forget?
I can start off. I started thinking about the concept of flash fiction, and this isn't the greatest example of flash fiction, but I always think this is like one of the most brilliant, funny, like shortest and longest story ever written. It's by John Barth from his Lost in the Funhouse story collection. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that, but he has this story that just I'll put it in front of the screen for people who are just listening. Basically, on one side of the page, it has this "Once Upon a Time" there, and it's got this dotted line where you're supposed to cut that that strip out of the book, and the other side of that strip says "Was a story that began." And what you do after you cut that strip out is that you tape the two sides together, so it kind of makes like an eternity symbol where it just says, "Once upon a time there was a story that began, once upon a time there was a story that began," and so on and so forth. And it's not deep, but I just
that
think
gave me
it's so
chills.
funny.
Yeah.
and it's it's as short as 10 words long, and as long as infinity.
That's incredible.
Yeah, that's so cool. I hadn't heard of that.
Yeah. It's the book is called Lost in the Funhouse, and it's a great collection of short fictions. It's a little bit older, but definitely worth a read. And beyond that, like any short fiction by Lori Moore, Andrea Barrett, like I love their short fiction. Speaking of like short stories that feel like incredible, well-formed worlds, Andrea, like Lori Moore, like can make me laugh with like, I'll just be reading so concerned about whatever's going on, and then she'll hit me with like a one-liner that makes me laugh out loud, and I'm like, how did that just happen? And then Andrea Barrett, I'll read hers, and it might be like a 30-page story, but I feel like I've just gone through like the whole Lord of the Rings trilogy because it's so dense and wonderful. So
I think mine is probably pretty standard. It's generally attributed to Hemingway, although there's like no proof, but it's just "For sale, baby shoes never worn." And the thing that I think is so incredibly powerful about that one sentence story is that it is packed with emotion, but it doesn't have any visual element to it. And as a writer, I very much conflate emotion to setting, right? So like description and like even characters describing how they're feeling is often how I can slip myself into that story and feel those feelings. But in that one sentence story, it doesn't need that. It just serves up that emotion to you right there, totally honest, and I love that.
Yeah, I always love that one, that example, and it always feels kind of like a haiku,
Yep.
in a way.
I love Lauren Groff's short writing. I think she is just such a beautiful writer. But when I think of short stories, and this might be because of the experience I had with the author, I think of Ben Laurie a lot, and he writes really, I think this is a good word, weird fiction. And he writes like, I would say like adult fairy tales. Like he takes concepts of how we used to write stories and then just makes them really unusual and really short. And he has this collection called Stories for Nighttime and Some for the Day. And there's a story in it called The Shadow. And it's literally like 2 sentences. And it's just, once there was a man who was afraid of his shadow. Then he met it. Now he glows in the dark. And it's just like that over and over again. Like the collection is just a little bit folklore-y, a little bit fantastical, but really emotional too. There's just something really sweet about his writing. And when he came to the university I went to and did a reading, and I was really nervous to meet him, and we got our book signed, and when it was my turn, he asked me what my name was. And I am also an introvert and like don't know how to, especially post-COVID, like have no idea how to interact with people. And I just handed him my copy and I was like, oh, my name's Michael, spelled the normal way. And so he signed it to Michael, spelled the normal way. And I was like, oh, you're really funny and sweet.
That's perfect.
But also I just want to throw out Lydia Davis is some of the best flash fiction I've ever read. She wrote a story about finding her dog's hair around her house after it passed, and it's like I think a paragraph long, and it's just so emotional and beautiful.
I don't think I would be able to read that
Yeah,
story.
it was a bad idea. Like I shouldn't have done it, but I'm glad I did it.
Yeah. I think so. For me, some of the stories that live, the short stories that live like rent free in my head, are the typical ones that you read for the first time in high school, like The Lottery or Hills, like White Elephants or Four White Elephants or whatever the Hemingway story one was. But I think those are those sort of shaped what I like in short stories now and what some of my favorite short stories are. I like the really creepy, disturbing, unsettling short stories. There's one in Rand Walker's collection, Portable Black Magic, about the paint color Haint Blue and about spirits using that paint color to enter and exit the house. And it is incredible and disturbing, and I love it so much. And then in his new collection of stories, I think it was Keep It 100, he has a 100-word story that is what happens next in the lottery.
Oh, wow.
And it is, like, because we just see the character being stoned to death, but what happens after that? What do they do with her body, and what does her family do? And he addresses that in 100 words, and it is, again, just as disturbing and incredible as the Shirley Jackson story.
One of the interesting things that I start thinking about is that maybe the power of flash fiction and short stories in general is just that you've got the story, the world, but then you've got all this white space surrounding it where you're not developing everything. Like there's a lot unsaid that maybe it's speaking of collaboration earlier, maybe there's a lot more collaboration with the reader creating what's happening outside in that white space.
Can I ask everyone a question? Do you find yourselves being drawn to to your point, Robert, I think when I'm reading a novel, I'm really interested in the way like setting is described. And when I'm reading short fiction, I think what I'm interested in is how people behave. And I'm just curious if you all could think about it. Like, do you read differently, or are you drawn to things differently when you read short fiction versus novels?
Yeah, I think for me, short fiction has to make decisions about where it's going to focus. So, so I think I probably do read differently, just because the writer has to write differently, because they have to, like in a book length story, you can develop everything, whereas in a shorter fiction, you really have to make conscious choices. Like, I'm going to focus on this and this, but like everything else, just going to have to ignore.
Right. That's true.
And I think for me, when it comes to shorter fiction, thinking more from like the writing aspect of it, I find it so much easier to play with point of view than with longer work. So when it comes to my longer fiction, I tend to write third person limited. But when it comes to Flash, especially, I find this like very unique, unusual voice that comes out of me that tends to be more like playful and comedic. And I tend to write a lot of second person, which I think can work very well in a very like contained, short. And I'm like a fan of really dark fiction. I don't normally love comedy, but I think that when it is so small, it can really open up a lot of avenues.
Yeah.
You can look at a subject in a funnier way than you might if, you know, you have to spend so much time with the reader getting them to like the characters. And at least for me, as a character-driven reader, it's more quote-unquote acceptable for me to not like a character in a short piece than it is in a long piece, because I don't want to spend that much time with
Not
them.
liking someone.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah.
That makes
A book
sense.
immediately comes to mind.
Yeah, same here.
Yeah, I think we were thinking of the same book.
Yes, and I have an additional one. There are two.
Speaking
I
of
guess,
white
that-
space out there for people to fill in.
Yeah. Well, this has been really fun. I want to keep talking to you all about short stories, but I think we need to move on to our guest interviews. So stay tuned for more.